My home and auto shop were destroyed by a fire, so I went to my daughter's house. Her husband blocked the door. "You'll ruin my Italian sofa. I have no place for a homeless old man." Desperate, I called my late best friend's son, a boy I treated like my own, now a billionaire. No one knew I had his contact. When he arrived in his brand new Rolls-Royce and said 5 words, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." I watched everything I'd built over 37 years turn to ash in less than 4 hours. The flames ate through my auto shop like they were hungry, devouring the hydraulic lifts, the tool cabinets I'd saved for months to buy, and the 1967 Mustang I'd been restoring for Mrs. Henderson down the street. The fire department said it started with an electrical fault in the old wiring. I'd been meaning to update it, but business had been slow and, well, you always think you have more time. The apartment above the shop went with it. Everything. My late wife Sarah's jewelry box, the photo albums, the recliner where I'd spent countless evenings reading repair manuals. Even the coffee mug Zoe made me in 3rd grade, the one with the crooked handle that said, "World's Best Dad," in her wobbly handwriting. Gone. I stood there on the sidewalk at 3 in the morning, wearing the same coveralls I'd had on when the fire alarm went off, watching the last flames flicker out. The Red Cross volunteer handed me a blanket and a bottle of water, asking if I had somewhere to go. I nodded, but honestly, I wasn't sure. My daughter Zoe lived 20 minutes away in Riverside Hills, the expensive part of town. She'd married Richard Pemberton 3 years ago, a real estate developer who wore suits that cost more than I used to make in a month. Their house was one of those modern things with too much glass and not enough soul, but it was big enough. Surely they had a spare room where an old man could sleep for a few nights while he figured things out. The insurance adjuster wouldn't be out until Monday, and even then, who knew how long it would take to settle? At 62, I didn't have the energy to start over, but I didn't have much choice either. The business had been my life since Sarah died 8 years ago. Now I had nothing but the clothes on my back and whatever was left in my checking account after paying last month's bills. I drove to Zoe's house in my pickup truck, the only thing that had survived because I'd parked it down the street. The dashboard clock read 4:15 in the morning, but this was an emergency. Family was supposed to be there for emergencies, right? The house was dark when I pulled into their circular driveway. Motion sensors lit up the walkway as I approached, making me feel like an intruder. I rang the doorbell and waited, then rang it again. Finally, I heard footsteps and the deadbolt turning. Richard opened the door wearing silk pajamas, his hair perfectly styled even at this hour. He looked me up and down, taking in my soot-stained coveralls and the smell of smoke that clung to everything. "Desmond, what are you doing here?" His voice carried that tone he always used with me, like he was talking to a child who tracked mud through the house. "There was a fire," I said, suddenly feeling foolish for coming here without calling first. "The shop, the apartment. Everything's gone." "Oh." He didn't step aside to let me in. That's unfortunate. I waited for him to invite me inside, to ask if I was hurt, to show even a flicker of concern. Instead, he glanced back into the house, then stepped outside and pulled the door closed behind him. "Look, Desmond, I'm sorry about your situation, but you can't stay here." He crossed his arms, blocking any chance I might have had of getting past him. "We just had the carpets professionally cleaned, and frankly, you smell like a chimney. Plus, Zoe's been having trouble sleeping lately. The stress of her new position at the marketing firm, you understand?" I stared at him, not quite believing what I was hearing. "I'm not asking for a handout, Richard. Just a place to sleep for a night or two while I sort things out." "And where exactly would you sleep? The guest room has white furniture, Italian leather. Do you have any idea what smoke damage could do to pieces like that?" He shook his head like I was being unreasonable. "No, I think it's best if you find alternative arrangements. There's a Motel 6 on Highway 9. Clean, affordable." The words hit me like a physical blow. "I'd like to talk to Zoe." "Zoe's asleep, and I'm not waking her up for this. She has a presentation on Monday that could make or break her career." Richard's voice grew colder. "Look, I get it. You're having a rough patch. But we can't be expected to solve your problems every time something goes wrong." "Every time?" I couldn't keep the hurt out of my voice. "When have I ever asked you for anything?" The implication is there, isn't it? You show up here in the middle of the night, homeless, expecting us to take you in. He gestured toward my truck. You're 62 years old, Desmond. Maybe it's time to consider that your little auto shop experiment has run its course. There are programs for people in your situation, social services, senior housing. The words cut deeper than the sight of my burning shop had. This wasn't some stranger talking to me like I was worthless. This was my daughter's husband, the man she'd chosen to build a life with. Where's Zoe? I asked again. I told you she's sleeping, and she's going to stay that way. Richard stepped back toward the door. I suggest you leave now before we have to call security. Security? In that moment, I understood exactly how he saw me. Not as family, not even as a human being deserving of basic compassion. I was a problem to be managed, a threat to be removed. I turned to leave, then stopped. Does she know I'm here? Richard's hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Somewhere inside that house, Zoe was awake. She'd heard the doorbell, heard our voices. She was letting her husband handle this because it was easier than facing me herself. The drive away from Zoe's house was the loneliest 20 minutes of my life. I had nowhere to go, no one to call. Sarah's sister lived in Florida now, and we hadn't spoken since the funeral. My brother had died 2 years ago. The few friends I'd had were really just customers who'd bring me their cars and chat while I worked on them. That's when I remembered Marcus. Marcus Rivera had been my best friend Tony's boy. When Tony died in a construction accident 12 years ago, Marcus was just 15. Angry at the world and headed for trouble. His mother had disappeared when he was 10, leaving Tony to raise him alone. After the funeral, with no other family and the state threatening to put Marcus in foster care, I'd stepped in. I couldn't officially adopt him. The legal process was too complicated and expensive, but I'd taken him into my home. Fed him, clothed him, made sure he got to school. More than that, I'd believed in him when nobody else would. When he got accepted to state university but couldn't afford tuition, I'd found a way to make it happen. When he'd wanted to start his own business after graduation but had no credit or collateral, I'd co-signed loans that could have destroyed me if he'd failed. But Marcus hadn't failed. Far from it. The last I'd heard, his company was worth more than I could imagine. We'd lost touch over the years. He'd gotten busy with success, and I'd been too proud to reach out when I started struggling. But he'd sent a Christmas card last year with a handwritten note. I'll never forget everything you did for me. I still had his number in my phone from when he'd called to tell me about landing his first big contract. My hands shook as I scrolled through my contacts, wondering if it was still current after all these years. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered, groggy with sleep but unmistakably warm. Desmond, Jesus, what time is it? Are you okay? Just hearing someone say my name with genuine concern made my throat tight. I'm sorry for calling so late, son. I didn't know who else to call. Don't you ever apologize for calling me, Marcus said, and I could hear him moving around, probably getting out of bed. What's wrong? And don't tell me nothing. I can hear it in your voice. I closed my eyes, gripping the steering wheel of my truck parked outside a 24-hour diner. The neon sign flickered, open, casting pink and blue shadows across the dashboard. There was a fire tonight. Lost the shop, lost everything. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Marcus spoke, his voice tight with emotion. Where are you right now? Sitting in my truck outside Pete's Diner on Route 7. I'm fine, just trying to figure out what comes next. Stay right there. I'm coming to get you. Marcus, you don't have to. The hell I don't. His voice was firm, the same tone he'd used as a teenager when he'd made up his mind about something. You took me in when I had nothing. You gave me everything. So don't you dare sit there and tell me I don't have to help you. I heard papers rustling, then computer keys clicking. I'm booking a flight right now. There's a red-eye that gets into regional airport at 6:30. Can you wait for me until then? The relief that washed over me was overwhelming. After Richard's cruelty, after Zoe's silence, hearing Marcus drop everything to help felt like finding water in the desert. You don't need to fly out here. I'll be fine. Desmond. He used my name the way he had when he was 17 and trying to convince me he was mature enough for something. Remember what you told me when I wanted to quit school after Dad died? You said that family doesn't give up on family. and that you'd never give up on me no matter what." I remembered. Marcus had been so angry back then, so convinced that the world was against him. It had taken months of patience and small victories to help him see that he had a future worth fighting for. "Well, you're my family," Marcus continued. "The only real family I've ever had, so I'm not giving up on you either." After we hung up, I sat in my truck watching the diner's late-night customers come and go. Truckers mostly, and a few insomniacs nursing coffee and staring at their phones. I thought about going inside, ordering something to eat, but my stomach was twisted in knots. Instead, I found myself thinking about Marcus as a kid. He'd been so thin when he first came to live with me. Not just physically, though he was that too, but thin in every way that mattered. Hollow-eyed and suspicious of kindness, expecting to be disappointed by anyone who tried to help him. Tony's death had shattered something fundamental in that boy, left him convinced that everyone he cared about would eventually leave him. I'd given him Tony's old room, but for the first month he'd slept on the floor with his back against the door. When I'd asked him why, he'd shrugged and said he liked to know his exits. It broke my heart. Slowly, carefully, I'd started showing him that not everyone would abandon him. When he'd failed his first math test and waited for me to yell at him like his previous foster families had, I'd sat down and helped him study instead. When he'd gotten into a fight at school and expected to be thrown out, I'd listened to his side of the story and helped him find better ways to handle his anger. The breakthrough had come 6 months later. I'd been working late in the shop, trying to finish a transmission job, when I'd heard a noise from the apartment upstairs. I'd found Marcus in the kitchen making 2 sandwiches. He'd handed one to me without a word, then sat down at the table to eat his own. "Figured you might be hungry," he'd said, not meeting my eyes. It was the first time he'd ever done something for me without being asked. The first time he'd thought about my needs instead of just his own survival. I'd known then that we were going to be okay. High school had been rough. Marcus was smart. Brilliant, actually. But he carried chip on his shoulder the size of Texas. He'd get into arguments with teachers who he thought were talking down to him. Refused to do assignments he considered pointless. His grades suffered, and by junior year his guidance counselor was suggesting he consider trade school instead of college. "Nothing wrong with trade school," I'd told him that night over dinner. "I never went to college, and I've done fine for myself." "But you want more for me, don't you?" Marcus had asked, studying my face carefully. "I want whatever makes you happy, son, but I also know you've got a mind that could take you anywhere you want to go. It'd be a shame not to use it." That's when Marcus had started applying himself. Not because I'd pushed him, but because he'd finally understood that someone believed in his potential. His grades shot up senior year, and when the acceptance letter from State University arrived, he'd run into the shop, waving it over his head like he'd won the lottery. The problem was money. Even with grants and work-study programs, we were looking at $15,000 a year we didn't have. I'd run the numbers a dozen times, hoping I'd missed something, but the math was brutal. My auto shop was doing okay, but not well enough to cover tuition for 4 years. That's when I'd made the decision that would change both our lives. I'd bought the auto shop from old Pete Sullivan back in 1988, taking out a loan against the building and equipment. By 2009, I'd finally paid it off. The shop was mine, free and clear, worth maybe $80,000 if I sold it outright. Instead, I'd gone to the bank and taken out a second mortgage. $80,000, enough to cover Marcus's tuition and living expenses for all 4 years of college. I told him it was a loan program I'd found, a special grant for kids whose parents had died in workplace accidents. He'd believed me because he'd wanted to believe me, and because at 18 he hadn't understood how money really worked. I'd never told him that I'd risked everything I owned to send him to school. Never mentioned that I'd gone from owning my business outright to carrying a debt that would take me 15 years to pay off. Never explained that the reason I'd started working longer hours, taking on more jobs, skipping vacations and new equipment purchases, was because every month I had to make a payment that equaled about half my profit. It had been worth it. Marcus had thrived in college, throwing himself into business classes, with the same intensity he'd once reserved for fighting. He'd graduated magna cum laude with a degree in business administration and immediately started working for a consulting firm in the city. But even after he'd landed a good job, I'd never told him the truth about how his education had been funded. What was the point? He'd already graduated, already started building his career. All it would do was make him feel guilty about choices I'd made freely. We'd stayed close for the first few years after graduation. He'd visit every few months, always bringing expensive gifts I didn't need and trying to give me money I was too proud to take. But gradually, as his career took off and his life got more complicated, the visits became less frequent. The phone calls grew shorter and further apart. I'd understood. Success brought its own obligations, and Marcus was building something important. The last thing he needed was an old mechanic reminding him where he'd come from. But sitting in that truck outside the diner, waiting for dawn and hoping Marcus would actually show up, I realized I'd made a mistake. Not in helping him. I'd do that again in a heartbeat. But in cutting myself off from the only person who might actually care whether I lived or died. My phone buzzed with a text message. "Just landed. On my way to you now. Hold tight." I stared at the message for a long time, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. At 7:15 in the morning, a gleaming black Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled into the diner parking lot, like something from a dream. I'd been nursing my fourth cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the sky orange and pink when I saw it through the window. The car moved with silent precision, its chrome details catching the early light. Marcus stepped out, wearing a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than I used to make in 3 months. But when he saw me walking toward him, his face broke into the same grin he had had as a teenager. Wide and genuine and completely unguarded. He crossed the distance between us in quick strides and pulled me into a hug that nearly lifted me off my feet. "Look at you," he said, holding me at arm's length and studying my face. Still tough as nails, even after everything. I managed a weak smile. "Don't know about tough. Feel pretty beaten up right now." "Beaten up maybe, but not beaten down. There's a difference." He squeezed my shoulder. "Come on, let's get you somewhere comfortable. We have a lot to talk about." "Marcus, I appreciate you coming, but I don't need charity. Just need to figure out my next move, that's all." He gave me a look I remembered from his college days, the one he'd get when I tried to downplay something important. "This isn't charity, Desmond. This is family taking care of family. Now get in the car before I have to physically carry you." The inside of the Rolls-Royce was like stepping into another world. Leather seats that felt like clouds, wood, paneling that gleamed like a mirror, and air that actually smelled expensive. Marcus settled beside me as his driver, a polite young man named David, pulled smoothly out of the parking lot. "I want to see it," Marcus said quietly. "The shop." I shook my head. "Nothing to see but ash and rubble." "I want to see it anyway." We drove in silence through the familiar streets of my neighborhood, past the hardware store where I'd bought supplies for 30 years, past the coffee shop where I'd eaten lunch most days, past the small houses where many of my customers lived. Everything looked different in the early morning light, shabbier somehow, like seeing your hometown through a stranger's eyes. The shop was worse than I'd remembered. In daylight, the destruction was complete and stark. The roof had caved in, leaving twisted metal beams pointing at the sky like broken fingers. The walls that had stood for 60 years were now piles of brick and mortar. Yellow tape surrounded the entire lot, and the acrid smell of smoke still hung in the air. Marcus got out of the car and stood looking at the ruins for a long time. I watched his face, trying to read his expression. Finally he spoke. "This is where you taught me to change my first oil pan." I nodded. "You were 16. Got more oil on yourself than in the drain pan. And over there," he pointed to what had been the office area, "that's where you helped me fill out my college applications. You did most of the work yourself." Marcus turned to face me, and I was surprised to see tears in his eyes. "You know what I remember most about this place? It wasn't just the car repairs. It was the way you made everyone feel welcome. Mrs. Chen from the grocery store bringing you homemade soup when you were working late. Old Mr. Patterson sitting in that folding chair by the bay doors, telling stories about the war while you worked on his Buick. This wasn't just a business, Desmond. This was a community center." He was right, though I'd never thought about it that way. The shop had always been more than just a place to fix cars. It was where neighbors came to catch up on gossip, where teenagers learned their first lessons about hard work, where people brought their problems along with their broken transmissions. "I want to rebuild it," Marcus said suddenly. "Son, that's kind of you, but not just rebuild it, expand it. I'm talking about a state-of-the-art facility, 10 bays instead of 4, modern equipment, computer diagnostics, everything you never had budget for. His voice grew more animated as he spoke. But more than that, I want to franchise the concept. Desmond's Auto Care, community-focused shops in neighborhoods across the state, places where people don't just get their cars fixed, but where they feel like they belong. I stared at him, not quite believing what I was hearing. Marcus, that would cost... Money I have plenty of. What I don't have is someone I trust to run it. Someone who understands that business isn't just about profit margins and quarterly reports. He gripped my arm. I need a partner, Desmond. Someone who knows how to build the kind of place where people want to come back. Before I could respond, my phone rang. Zoe's name appeared on the screen. I hesitated, then answered. Dad? Her voice was small, uncertain. Richard told me about the fire. Are you okay? I'm fine, sweetheart. Where are you staying? I mean, do you need... She trailed off, and I could almost hear Richard in the background, probably shaking his head. I'm with Marcus Rivera, I said. Silence. Then, Marcus, Tony Rivera's son? I thought you two lost touch years ago. We did, but he's here now. That's good. I'm glad you have somewhere to go. Another pause. Listen, about last night. Richard was just worried about the house, you know? The insurance, and if something happened to the furniture. I understand, Zoe. But I didn't, and neither did she. What I understood was that my daughter had chosen a man who saw me as a liability, and she'd chosen to go along with his judgment rather than stand up for her father. Maybe we could have lunch this week, she said, when things settle down. Maybe, I said, though we both knew it wasn't likely. After I hung up, Marcus studied my face. That was your daughter. Yeah. The one who wouldn't let you stay at her house last night. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised me. You know, for years I wondered why you never talked about Zoe much. When I was living with you, you'd ask about my homework, my friends, my dreams. But you never mentioned your own daughter except in passing. I used to think maybe you didn't care about her as much as you cared about me. That's not true, I said quickly. I know that now. What I understand now is that you were protecting her privacy. You didn't share her business with me because you respected her as a person, not just as your child. Marcus shook his head. But I also think you protected her from knowing how hard you were working to take care of both of us. She never knew about the second mortgage, did she? She never knew you were risking everything to send me to college. I didn't answer, which was answer enough. She never knew because you didn't want her to resent me. You didn't want her to feel like you love me more than her. Marcus's voice was soft but intense. But here's what I think really happened. I think she grew up seeing you give me opportunities and attention, and she never understood that it was because I had nothing and no one else. She had a mother who loved her, a stable home, a father who was present and engaged. I had you, or foster care. The truth in his words hit me like a physical blow. I never meant for her to feel less important. I know you didn't, but intentions don't always match impact, do they? We stood there in the rubble of my life's work, and I felt the weight of all the choices I'd made pressing down on me. Had I failed Zoe by helping Marcus? Had I created the distance between us by trying to save a broken kid who wasn't even my own son? There's something else, Marcus said, pulling out his phone. Something I should have told you years ago. He scrolled through his contacts and held the phone so I could see the screen. There in his favorites list was my name, but it wasn't listed as Desmond Thompson. It was listed as Dad. I've had it that way since college graduation, he said quietly. You're the only father I've ever known. The only man who ever believed in me, ever sacrificed for me, ever loved me unconditionally. He looked up at me and his voice broke slightly. I should have told you that before now. I felt my throat close up. In 62 years of living, through marriage and parenthood and loss and struggle, no one had ever told me I was a good father, not even my own daughter. Now, Marcus said, wiping his eyes and straightening his shoulders, we need to go have a conversation with your daughter and her husband, because they need to understand exactly who they turned away last night. The drive to Zoe's house took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. I kept trying to imagine how this would go, what I would say, how she would react. Marcus sat beside me, calm and focused in a way that reminded me of the determined teenager who'd refused to let anyone tell him he wasn't good enough for college. "You don't have to do this," I told him as we pulled into Zoe's driveway. "Yes, I do," he said simply. "You defended me when I had no one. Now I'm going to defend you." Richard answered the door wearing weekend clothes, khakis and a polo shirt that probably cost more than most people's car payments. His expression went from annoyed to confused to something approaching panic when he saw the Rolls-Royce in his driveway and Marcus standing beside me. "Desmond, who is this?" "This is Marcus Rivera," I said. "I believe you suggested I find alternative arrangements. Well, Marcus is my alternative arrangement." Richard's eyes darted between us, clearly trying to process what was happening. "Rivera? Why does that name sound familiar?" Marcus stepped forward and extended his hand. "Perhaps you know Rivera Holdings. We've been acquiring underperforming commercial real estate in this area. I believe we bought several properties from your company last year." I watched the color drain from Richard's face. Rivera Holdings was a major player in the local commercial market, the kind of company that could make or break smaller developers like Richard's firm. "Oh," Richard stammered, suddenly switching to his professional manner. "Mr. Rivera, of course, it's an honor to meet you." He looked back at me, confusion written across his face. "I don't understand. How do you two know each other?" Marcus smiled, but it wasn't a warm expression. "Desmond raised me. He's been more of a father to me than my biological father ever was." "I'm sorry, I don't follow. Let me make it simple for you," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the steel I remembered from his teenage years when someone had underestimated him. "The man you called homeless last night, the man you told to sleep in a motel, is the most important person in my life. He sacrificed everything to make sure I had a future, and you treated him like garbage." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Behind him I could see Zoe approaching, her face pale and drawn. Marcus stepped closer to Richard, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more authority than shouting would have. "Desmond is my father," he said, each word deliberate and clear. "And in about 5 minutes, everyone in this neighborhood is going to understand exactly what kind of man you turned away from your door." Zoe appeared in the doorway behind Richard, her hair still mussed from sleep, wearing a silk robe that probably cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. When she saw Marcus, her expression shifted from confusion to recognition, then to something approaching fear. "Marcus? Oh my God, is that really you?" She pushed past Richard, studying Marcus's face. "I barely recognized you. You look so different." "Success will do that to a person," Marcus replied coolly. "Though I notice some people haven't changed at all." Richard was still processing what Marcus had said about being my son. "I'm sorry, I must be misunderstanding something. Desmond, you never mentioned having another child." "He's not my biological son," I said quietly. "But he's my son in every way that matters." Zoe frowned, looking between us. "Dad, what's going on? Why are you here with Marcus, and whose car is that?" "Mine," Marcus said simply. "Would you like to know how I could afford it?" Something in his tone made Zoe step back. "I don't understand." "Your father paid for my college education, all 4 years. Tuition, room and board, books, everything." Marcus's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, but his eyes never left Zoe's face. $60,000 total. Do you know where that money came from?" Zoe glanced at me, then back at Marcus. "Dad said there was some kind of scholarship program." "There was no scholarship program." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her something on the screen. "This is a copy of the second mortgage your father took out on his auto shop in 2009. $80,000 borrowed against the only asset he owned to send me to State University." I watched the color drain from my daughter's face. "That's not... Dad, tell me that's not true." I couldn't meet her eyes. Marcus needed a chance, sweetheart. His father was gone, and he had nobody else. "But you had me." Zoe's voice rose, attracting attention from neighbors who were starting their weekend morning routines. "I was your daughter. Why didn't you take out a loan for my college? You didn't need one, I said softly. You had your mother's life insurance policy. You had the education fund we'd been paying into since you were born. You had a full ride to state because of your grades and that tennis scholarship. But you still chose him over me. I didn't choose anyone over anyone, I said, my voice stronger now. I helped a kid who had nothing because that's what decent people do. Marcus stepped forward, his presence commanding even in the suburban driveway. Zoe, do you know what your father did after he took out that mortgage? He started working 80-hour weeks to make the payments. He took jobs he'd never taken before. Oil changes, tire rotations, basic maintenance. Because they paid cash and he needed every dollar he could get. I don't want to hear this, Zoe said, but she didn't move away. He stopped taking vacations, stopped going out to dinner, stopped buying anything for himself that wasn't absolutely necessary. Marcus's voice grew more intense. Do you know why he drove that old pickup truck for 12 years instead of getting something newer? Because every dollar he wasn't spending on himself was a dollar going toward my education debt. Richard finally found his voice. Okay, this is all very touching, but what does any of this have to do with last night? Marcus turned to him with the kind of look that could freeze water. What it has to do with last night is that you treated the most generous man I've ever known like he was some kind of vagrant. You turned away someone who has spent his entire life helping others. I was protecting my home, my family. Your family? Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. Let me tell you about family, Richard. Family is what Desmond showed me when he took in a 15-year-old kid with anger issues and no future. Family is working 3 jobs to keep a roof over someone's head and food on the table. Family is believing in someone when they don't believe in themselves. He gestured toward the house, toward the perfect lawn and expensive cars. This isn't family. This is a business arrangement. You married Zoe for her connections and her mother's money. She married you for security and status, but neither of you knows the first thing about actual love or sacrifice. You don't know anything about our marriage, Zoe said, but her voice lacked conviction. I know that when your father, the man who raised me, who taught me everything I know about integrity and hard work, showed up at your door with nothing but the clothes on his back, you let your husband turn him away. Marcus's voice was quiet now, which somehow made it more powerful. I know that you've been so busy playing house with your rich husband that you forgot where you came from. That's not fair, Zoe whispered. Fair? Marcus pulled out his phone again, scrolling through what looked like financial documents. You want to talk about fair? Let me show you what fair looks like. He turned the phone so both Zoe and Richard could see the screen. This is the payment history for your father's second mortgage. Look at the dates. Look at the amounts. For 15 years, he's been paying $867 a month for a loan he took out to educate someone else's child. Zoe's eyes widened as she scanned the information. Dad, this says you still owe $32,000. I've been making payments, I said simply. But this means... She looked up at me, realization dawning. This means you've been struggling financially for years. This whole time when I complained about money being tight, when I said I couldn't understand why you never seemed to have anything saved up. I had enough, I lied. No, you didn't. Marcus's voice cut through my attempt at deflection. Do you want to know how I know that? Because last Christmas, when I sent your father a check for $5,000 as a gift, he sent it back with a note saying he didn't need charity. But I ran a credit check anyway, because that's what you do in business. You verify information. He looked directly at Zoe. Your father has been living paycheck to paycheck for over a decade, all because he gave everything he had to help me build a life. And when I finally had enough success to pay him back, he was too proud to accept it. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Look, we all appreciate the history lesson, but... Shut up, Marcus said without even looking at him. Adults are talking. The dismissal was so casual and complete that Richard actually took a step backward. Marcus continued addressing Zoe. Do you know what your father told me when I got my first promotion? When I called to share the good news, he said he was proud of me. Not proud of what I'd achieved, but proud of who I'd become. He said that seeing me succeed was worth more than any money he'd ever spent. Tears were rolling down Zoe's cheeks now. Dad, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you explain what you were doing? Because it wasn't your burden to carry, I said. You were my daughter. It was my job to take care of you, not the other way around. But I could have helped. I could have understood. Could you? Marcus interrupted. Because from where I stand, it looks like you spent the last 20 years judging your father for not being successful enough, not realizing that his lack of success was because he gave everything he had to someone else. The neighborhood had grown quiet around us, but I could sense people watching from behind curtains and partially open doors. The wealthy enclave of Riverside Hills wasn't used to this kind of drama in their perfectly manicured streets. Marcus seemed to notice the attention too, because he raised his voice slightly. You know what the real tragedy is here? Your father could have been a wealthy man by now. If he'd never taken in a homeless teenager, if he'd never risked his business to pay for someone else's education, he'd probably own half the commercial real estate in this town by now. But he chose to help someone who needed it, and that choice has defined every day of his life since. He stepped closer to Zoe, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than shouting. And last night, when the man who sacrificed everything for everyone else finally needed help himself, you let your husband treat him like a stranger. You let him drive away with nowhere to go because acknowledging him might have made your perfect life a little bit uncomfortable. Zoe was sobbing openly now, her silk robe damp with tears. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. You didn't want to know, Marcus corrected. There's a difference. Richard, who had been growing more agitated during this entire exchange, finally exploded. Enough. This is my home, my property, and I want all of you to leave. Now, before I call the police. Marcus turned to look at him for the first time in several minutes, and his smile was absolutely predatory. Please do call the police, Richard. I'd love to explain to them how you refused shelter to a homeless fire victim. I'm sure that would make a wonderful story for the local news. You're threatening me? I'm educating you, Marcus replied calmly. See, the difference between you and me is that I earned everything I have. You married into whatever success you think you've achieved. And now you're learning that actions have consequences. He pulled out his business card and handed it to Richard. Rivera Holdings has been looking to expand our commercial development portfolio in this area. Your company has several projects we've been considering partnering with. Had been considering? Richard looked at the card, and I watched his face go pale as he processed what Marcus was saying. Have a good day, Marcus said pleasantly. Then he turned to me. Come on, Dad, let's go home. As we walked back to the Rolls-Royce, I could hear Zoe calling after me. Dad, please, can we talk? Can we work this out? I paused with my hand on the car door, looking back at my daughter standing in the driveway of her perfect house, tears streaming down her face. For a moment I felt the old pull of paternal instinct, the desire to comfort her and make everything okay. But then I remembered the sound of that door closing last night, the finality of Richard's dismissal, the choice Zoe had made to stay silent while her husband treated me like nothing. Maybe someday, sweetheart, I said softly, but not today. As we drove away, Marcus was quiet for a long time. Finally he spoke. I'm sorry you had to go through that. Are you? I asked. Or are you satisfied that they finally know the truth? He considered this. Both, I think. I'm sorry because I know it hurt you, but I'm not sorry. They know what kind of man you really are. He paused. The question now is, what do you want to do next? I looked out the window at the familiar streets of my hometown, seeing them differently now. Everything had changed in the space of 12 hours. My old life was literally ashes, but something new was beginning to take shape. Tell me more about this auto shop franchise idea, I said. Marcus's grin was the same one I remembered from his teenage years, full of possibility and determination. Now you're talking. Marcus's downtown office occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming glass tower that hadn't existed the last time I'd been in the city center. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor was silent except for the soft hum of expensive machinery. And when the doors opened, I stepped into a world I'd only seen in magazines. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the entire metropolitan area. I could see my old neighborhood from here, a patchwork of modest homes and small businesses that looked almost quaint from this height. Somewhere down there in a pile of ash and rubble was everything I'd built over 4 decades of work. "Impressive, isn't it?" Marcus said, following my gaze. "But you know what I see when I look out there? I see opportunity. I see communities that need what we're going to build." His assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia, brought us coffee in china cups that probably cost more than I used to charge for an oil change. Marcus had changed into a fresh suit. Apparently he kept several at the office, but he'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves. It made him look more like the determined teenager I remembered. "Before we talk business," he said, settling into the chair across from me, "I need you to understand something. What happened this morning at your daughter's house? That wasn't about revenge. That was about respect. You deserve to have them know the truth about what kind of man you are." I nodded, though part of me still felt hollow about the whole encounter. "Zoe's been calling. 7 times since we left. Are you going to call her back?" "I don't know." I stared into my coffee cup, watching steam rise from the dark surface. "Part of me wants to. She's still my daughter, regardless of everything else." "And part of you?" "Part of me thinks maybe it's too late. Maybe some things can't be fixed." Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "Can I tell you what I learned about forgiveness?" I looked up at him, waiting. "When I was in college, I used to be angry at my father for dying. I know that sounds stupid, but I was furious with him for leaving me alone. I blamed him for everything that went wrong in my life after the accident." Marcus paused, collecting his thoughts. "It took me years to understand that anger was just hurt, wearing a disguise." "What changed your mind?" "You did. The way you talked about him, the way you kept his memory alive for me. You never let me forget that he was a good man who loved me, even though his leaving hurt us both." Marcus smiled slightly. "You taught me that forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about choosing not to let the hurt define your future." I considered this. "Are you saying I should forgive Zoe?" "I'm saying that's your choice to make. But I'm also saying you don't have to make it today, or tomorrow, or even next year. Forgiveness works on its own timeline." He set down his coffee cup. "Now let's talk about building something new." Marcus opened a leather portfolio and spread several documents across the glass coffee table between us. Architectural drawings, financial projections, market analysis reports, the kind of professional presentation I'd never seen outside of banks when I was trying to get business loans. "Desmond's Auto Care," he said, pointing to a logo at the top of each page. "Community-focused automotive service centers. Not just repair shops, but neighborhood gathering places where people feel valued and respected." The drawings showed a building that was both modern and welcoming. Large windows, comfortable waiting areas with real furniture instead of plastic chairs, a coffee bar, even a small play area for customers' children. It looked nothing like the cramped utilitarian shops I was used to. "This is beautiful," I said, studying the details. "But it's not what people expect from an auto shop." "Exactly. That's what makes it revolutionary." Marcus pulled out another set of papers. "The average customer spends 2 to 3 hours in a traditional auto shop for major repairs. They sit in uncomfortable chairs, drink stale coffee, and feel like they're being taken advantage of. We're going to change all of that." He pointed to different areas of the floor plan as he explained his vision. Transparent pricing displayed on digital boards. Customers can watch the work being done through windows into the service bays. Free Wi-Fi, quality coffee, and comfortable seating. We're not just fixing cars, we're providing an experience that makes people want to come back. The financial projections were staggering. Initial investment of $800,000 per location, with projected annual revenues of $2.4 million by year 3. The numbers seemed impossible to someone who'd been happy to clear $50,000 profit in a good year. "This is a lot of money we're talking about," I said carefully. "Money I have," Marcus replied without hesitation. "The question isn't whether we can afford to do this. The question is whether you want to help me do it right." I looked up at him. "What do you mean?" "I can build beautiful shops and hire skilled mechanics and create impressive marketing campaigns. But what I can't do is create the culture that makes people feel like family when they walk through those doors. That's something you have to live, not learn. Marcus leaned back in his chair. I've watched you work for years, Desmond. I've seen how you treat people. Mrs. Chen trusts you with her car because you've never lied to her. Mr. Patterson comes to your shop because you listen to his stories and make him feel important. That's not a business model you can replicate with training manuals. So, what are you proposing? Partnership. 50-50 ownership, with you as Chief Operating Officer and me handling financing and expansion strategy. We start with 5 locations in markets I've already researched, then grow from there. Marcus pulled out one more document. This is the partnership agreement my lawyers drew up. Take your time reading it. But the basic terms are simple. You provide the expertise and leadership, I provide the capital and business infrastructure. I scanned the contract, trying to process what I was seeing. Salary of $150,000 per year, plus profit sharing, plus equity stakes in each new location. After a lifetime of scraping by, the numbers seemed unreal. Marcus, this is incredibly generous, but nothing. This isn't charity, and it's not a gift. This is me offering you the chance to build something bigger than either of us could create alone. His voice grew more intense. You gave me the foundation for everything I've achieved. Now I want to give you the platform to share what you know with thousands of people instead of just the few dozen who could afford to bring their cars to your shop. Before I could respond, there was a soft knock at the office door. Patricia entered, looking apologetic. I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Rivera, but there's a situation. Richard Pemberton is in the lobby asking to see you. He says it's urgent business regarding the Riverside Hills commercial development project. Marcus and I exchanged glances. Richard had wasted no time trying to repair whatever damage he thought had been done to his business relationship. Send him up, Marcus said with a slight smile. This should be interesting. 10 minutes later, Richard stood in the middle of Marcus's office looking like a man who'd been running uphill in the heat. His expensive clothes were wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and there was a desperate quality to his smile that made me almost feel sorry for him. Mr. Rivera, thank you so much for agreeing to see me. I want to apologize for this morning. There was obviously some kind of misunderstanding, and I'd like the chance to clear the air. Marcus gestured to a chair but remained standing himself. Please sit. And there was no misunderstanding, Mr. Pemberton. I understood your position perfectly. Richard perched on the edge of the chair, clearly uncomfortable. I think perhaps Desmond didn't explain our relationship properly. He's my father-in-law, and of course we care about his well-being. It's just that the timing was difficult, with the house full of guests and Zoe feeling unwell. Guests? Marcus raised an eyebrow. At 4 a.m. Well, no, not exactly guests, but... And Zoe feeling unwell? From what I observed, she seemed perfectly capable of standing and speaking when we arrived this morning. Richard's face flushed red. Look, I made a mistake, okay? I was tired, I wasn't thinking clearly, but that doesn't mean our business relationship has to suffer. Marcus walked to the window, looking out at the city below. Tell me about the Riverside Hills project, Richard. It's a mixed-use development. Retail, office space, high-end residential units. Exactly the kind of property that Rivera Holdings specializes in. Richard's voice grew more confident as he moved into familiar territory. We've invested 18 months and nearly $2 million in planning and permits. All we need now is a major partner to help with construction financing. And you thought that partner might be me? Well, yes. Your company has the capital and expertise we need, and we have the local knowledge and relationships to make the project successful. Marcus turned back to face Richard. What's your timeline? We need to close the financing deal within 60 days, or we lose our permits and our initial investment. Richard leaned forward eagerly. But with Rivera Holdings as a partner, I'm confident we can move forward quickly. I see. Marcus returned to his desk and pulled out a thick file folder. I've actually been following your project quite closely, Richard. My development team has been tracking all the major commercial projects in this area. He opened the folder and spread several documents across his desk. Riverside Hills Phase 1. Projected cost, $47 million. Projected timeline, 36 months. Projected return on investment, 18% annually. Marcus looked up at Richard. Those are impressive numbers. Richard's relief was visible. Yes, exactly. It's going to be a tremendous success. Which is why I've decided to proceed with the project myself. The color drained from Richard's face. I'm sorry, what? Rivera Holdings filed permits this morning for our own mixed-use development on the adjacent property. Same basic concept, but larger scale and better financing. Marcus's voice was conversational, almost friendly. We'll break ground in 6 weeks. Richard stood up so quickly he knocked over his chair. You can't do that. We have exclusivity agreements with the city planning department. For your specific parcel, yes? But the property line survey revealed some interesting discrepancies in the original documentation. It turns out your project area is about 30% smaller than you thought. Marcus smiled. Our development will be directly adjacent to yours, with better parking, more attractive storefronts, and significantly lower commercial rents. That will kill our project, Richard whispered. Very likely, yes. Richard stared at Marcus for a long moment, then his expression hardened. This is about this morning, isn't it? You're destroying my business because of some family drama. Marcus stood up and suddenly the friendly businessman disappeared, replaced by someone much colder and more dangerous. No, Richard. I'm destroying your business because you're a small petty man who treats people like disposable commodities. This morning just helped me realize that Rivera Holdings should be more selective about our business partners. You can't do this. I'll sue you. You will do nothing, Marcus interrupted, because every permit we've filed is completely legal, every contract we've signed is fully enforceable, and every dollar we're investing is our own. You, on the other hand, are about to default on $2 million in development loans because your project is no longer financially viable. Richard looked at me with something approaching panic. Desmond, please. You have to understand, I was protecting my family. Any man would have done the same thing. I stood up and walked to where he was standing. Any man? Really? I kept my voice calm, though anger was building in my chest. Any man would turn away a fire victim at 4 a.m. Any man would tell his own father-in-law to sleep in his truck because Italian leather matters more than human decency. I made a mistake. You made a choice, I corrected. And choices have consequences. Richard looked between Marcus and me, desperation growing in his eyes. What do you want? Money? An apology? I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Marcus walked to the office door and held it open. What I want, Richard, is for you to leave. And what I want you to remember is that the homeless old man you turned away last night just became your business partner's worst nightmare. After Richard left, Marcus and I stood in the quiet office for several minutes. The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded me of better times. Was that too harsh? Marcus asked finally. I thought about Richard's smug dismissal, about sleeping in my truck outside a diner, about the way he'd looked at me like I was something dirty that might contaminate his perfect life. No, I said. That was justice. Marcus nodded and returned to the partnership documents on his desk. So, what do you say? Ready to build something new? I looked at the architectural drawings, at the financial projections, at the opportunity to create something bigger than I'd ever imagined possible. Then I thought about Zoe, still calling my phone every hour, finally understanding what she'd lost when she chose comfort over family. Yes, I said, picking up the pen Marcus offered me. Let's build something new. 8 months later, I stood in the main bay of the first Desmond's Auto Care location, watching our newest mechanic, Jake Morrison, explain a transmission repair to Mrs. Chen through the observation window. She nodded along, asking questions about the process, completely comfortable in a way that would have been impossible in most traditional auto shops. The space was everything Marcus had promised and more. Gleaming white floors that actually stayed clean, state-of-the-art diagnostic equipment that could identify problems in minutes instead of hours, and an atmosphere that felt more like a high-end retail store than a garage. But what made me proudest was something that couldn't be measured in square footage or equipment costs, the way people felt when they walked through our doors. Mr. Thompson, Jake called out, using the formal address I'd insisted on for customer interactions. Mrs. Chen would like to know if we can have her car ready by Thursday afternoon. I walked over to where they stood, separated by the floor-to-ceiling glass that let customers observe all work being performed on their vehicles. "Absolutely, Mrs. Chen. Jake's one of our best transmission specialists, and we'll have you back on the road well before the weekend." She smiled and bowed slightly. "Thank you. And please tell Marcus I said the coffee bar is much better than Starbucks." After she left, I made my rounds through the facility, checking on the other 3 bays, reviewing the day's schedule with our service advisors, and stopping by the customer lounge where a handful of people waited comfortably in leather chairs while their cars were serviced. Business had exceeded every projection Marcus's team had developed. Word of mouth in the community had been extraordinary, and we were booked solid for the next 3 weeks. More importantly, customer satisfaction surveys consistently rated us above 95%. With most complaints being about our popularity making it difficult to get same-day appointments. The success of the first location had accelerated our expansion timeline. Construction was already underway on locations 2 and 3, with sites 4 and 5 scheduled to break ground before Christmas. Marcus had started fielding calls from potential franchisees in other states, people who wanted to bring the Desmond's Auto Care concept to their communities. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Heading your way. Have someone I want you to meet." 20 minutes later, Marcus walked through the front entrance, followed by a woman in her 40s wearing a business suit and carrying a leather briefcase. She had the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being taken seriously in professional settings. "Desmond, I'd like you to meet Jennifer Walsh from Automotive Weekly. She's writing a feature article about innovative approaches to customer service in the auto repair industry." Jennifer shook my hand with a firm grip. "Mr. Thompson, I have to say, this facility is unlike anything I've seen in 20 years of covering this industry. Marcus has told me some of your story, but I'd love to hear directly from you about your philosophy of customer service." We spent an hour walking through the shop while I explained our approach, how we'd eliminated the traditional barriers between customers and mechanics, how our transparent pricing eliminated the mistrust that plagued most auto repair relationships, how we created an environment where people felt comfortable asking questions and learning about their vehicles instead of feeling intimidated or taken advantage of. "What I find most interesting," Jennifer said as we finished the tour, "is that this isn't really about automotive repair, is it? This is about human dignity." I nodded. "Every person who walks through that door is somebody's mother, father, son, daughter. They deserve to be treated with respect, not like their ignorance about cars makes them fair game for exploitation. And this philosophy comes from your personal experience." I glanced at Marcus, who gave me an encouraging nod. Over the past 8 months, I'd gotten more comfortable talking about the principles that guided our business, though I still preferred to focus on customers rather than my own story. "It comes from understanding what it feels like to be overlooked," I said carefully. "When you spend most of your life working with your hands, some people assume that means you don't work with your mind. They treat you like you're somehow less intelligent or less valuable than people who work in offices." I paused. I never wanted anyone to feel that way in a shop that had my name on it. After Jennifer left to write her article, Marcus and I sat in my office going over the weekly performance reports. Revenue was up 18% from the previous month, and our customer retention rate was holding steady at 96%. "The board meeting is next week," Marcus said, referring to the quarterly gathering of Rivera Holdings' senior leadership. "I want to present our expansion plan for next year. 25 locations across 4 states with projected combined revenues of $68 million. The numbers still amazed me. A year ago, I'd been happy to clear $3,000 in a good month. Now I was part of a business venture that would soon employ over 400 people. "Have you given any more thought to the franchise opportunities?" Marcus continued. "We've got serious inquiries from groups in Texas, Florida, and Arizona. I want to make sure we don't grow so fast that we lose what makes this special," I said. "It's one thing to teach people our processes and procedures. It's another thing to teach them how to care about strangers." "Agreed. That's why I think we need to be very selective about franchise partners. People who understand that this is about more than just profit margins." My phone rang, displaying a number I'd come to recognize over the past several months. Zoe. She'd been calling regularly since that morning at her house, leaving voicemails that progressed from frantic apologies to tentative updates about her life to, most recently, simple messages saying she loved me and hoped I was doing well. I'd listened to every message, but I hadn't returned any of the calls. Not out of cruelty, but because I wasn't ready. The hurt was still too fresh, the betrayal still too raw. Marcus was right about forgiveness working on its own timeline, and my timeline wasn't ready for reconciliation. You know, Marcus said after I let the call go to voicemail, avoiding her forever isn't really a solution. I'm not avoiding her forever. I'm just not ready to deal with her yet. Fair enough. But when you are ready, you should know that she's been asking about you. Through mutual acquaintances, through people who know people. She's trying to understand what happened to her life. I looked at him sharply. What do you mean? Richard's development company went bankrupt 3 months ago. They lost everything when our competing project killed the financing for Riverside Hills. House is in foreclosure. Marriage is apparently in serious trouble. Marcus shrugged. I don't take any pleasure in their suffering, but actions have consequences. And Zoe? Living in a rental apartment, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. The marketing firm let her go when Richard's company defaulted on some consulting contracts. He paused. She's learning what it feels like to struggle. I felt a complicated mix of emotions hearing this. Part of me was sorry that Zoe was going through financial difficulties. But another part of me, a part I wasn't proud of, felt like maybe she was finally understanding what real life looked like for people who didn't have trust funds and wealthy husbands to fall back on. I should probably call her back, I said finally. Only if you want to. There's no obligation here, Desmond. You don't owe her anything just because you share DNA. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Jake Morrison poked his head in, looking excited about something. Mr. Thompson, there's someone here to see you. Says his name is Tony Patterson, and that you rebuilt his Buick's engine about 15 years ago. I smiled, remembering the old gentleman who used to spend afternoons in my shop telling stories about World War II while I worked on his car. Send him back, Jake. Tony appeared in the doorway a minute later, moving slowly but steadily with the help of a walking cane. He was probably 85 now, his hair completely white, but his eyes were still sharp and alert. Well, I'll be damned, he said, looking around the office with its polished furniture and wall-mounted television displaying our customer satisfaction statistics. Desmond Thompson, you've certainly moved up in the world. I stood up and shook his hand, genuinely happy to see him. Mr. Patterson, it's great to see you. How's the Buick running? Oh, I had to give up driving 2 years ago. Vision isn't what it used to be, and my daughter insisted I was becoming a hazard to public safety. He chuckled. But I heard through the grapevine that you'd opened this fancy new place, and I had to come see for myself. I introduced him to Marcus, explaining how Tony had been a regular customer at my old shop. Marcus immediately invited him to join us for coffee. And for the next hour, Tony regaled us with stories about the old neighborhood and updates on people I hadn't heard from in years. You know what I remember most about your old shop? Tony said as our conversation wound down. It wasn't the quality of the work, so that was always top-notch. It was the way you made people feel welcome, like their problems mattered to you, even if it was just a squeaky brake or a burned-out headlight. He looked around the modern facility, visible through the office windows. This place is impressive, don't get me wrong, but I'm glad to see you haven't forgotten that cars are just machines. It's the people who matter. After Tony left, promising to bring some of his friends by for a tour, Marcus and I returned to our business planning. But something about the old man's visit had reminded me of why we were doing all this in the first place. You know, I said, maybe we should slow down the expansion timeline. Make sure we're doing this right before we get too big to maintain quality. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. I've been thinking the same thing. Better to have 10 perfect locations than 25 mediocre ones. We were wrapping up our meeting when my phone rang again. Zoe's number for the second time that day. This time, instead of letting it go to voicemail, I answered. Hello, Zoe. Dad? Her voice was smaller than I remembered, uncertain. I wasn't sure you'd answer. I'm here. I know I don't have the right to ask, but could we meet? Just to talk. I understand if you don't want to, but I've been hoping. I looked at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. Okay, I said. But not at your house and not at mine. Somewhere neutral. Anywhere you want. I just want the chance to talk to you. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown the following Saturday morning. After I hung up, Marcus smiled at me. Feel good about that decision. Ask me after Saturday. But as I drove home that evening to the modest apartment I'd rented near the shop, I found myself cautiously optimistic. Not about rebuilding my relationship with Zoe, that would take time and might never happen completely, but about the possibility that both of us had learned enough about what really mattered to have a conversation based on honesty rather than expectation. Saturday morning arrived grey and drizzly, the kind of weather that made staying in bed seem like the wisest option. But I got up early, showered, and put on the one good suit I'd bought since starting the new business. Not because I was trying to impress Zoe, but because I wanted to feel like the man I'd become rather than the man I'd been when she last saw me. The coffee shop was busy with weekend customers, but I spotted Zoe immediately. She sat at a corner table wearing jeans and a simple sweater that looked like they'd come from a department store rather than a boutique. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, and she looked tired in a way that went deeper than just poor sleep. "Dad," she said, standing up when she saw me approach. "Thank you for coming." I sat down across from her, noting the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly around her coffee cup. "You look different." "I feel different. Everything's different now." She met my eyes directly for the first time in years. "I wanted to apologize. Not because I'm hoping you'll fix my problems, but because you deserve better than what Richard and I gave you that night." "Okay." I've been thinking a lot about what Marcus said, about how I never knew what you'd sacrificed for him, what you'd given up to help someone who needed it. Her voice was steady, but I could see tears forming. And I realized that I spent most of my adult life angry at you for not being successful enough, not realizing that your lack of conventional success was because you'd chosen to put other people first. I didn't respond immediately, letting her words settle between us. "I also realized," she continued, "that I'd become someone I didn't recognize, someone who cared more about appearances than about people. Someone who would let her husband treat her father like a stranger because it was easier than standing up for what was right." "What happened to your marriage?" I asked. Zoe laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Turns out Richard only wanted to be married to the successful version of me. When the money disappeared and the social connections dried up, so did his interest in playing husband." She shrugged. "We're getting divorced. Should be final next month." "I'm sorry." "I'm not anymore. Losing everything taught me the difference between having a life and living a life." She leaned forward slightly. "Dad, I know I don't have the right to ask for anything from you. I know I hurt you in ways that might not be fixable, but I want you to know that I understand now what I threw away." We talked for 2 hours, not about reconciliation or forgiveness or what our relationship might look like going forward, but about the people we'd become and the lessons we'd learned from our mistakes. Zoe told me about working retail for the first time in her life, about learning to budget for groceries, about discovering that she was stronger than she'd ever needed to be when everything came easily. I told her about the business, about the satisfaction of building something meaningful, about Marcus's friendship and partnership. I told her about choosing to find purpose in the wreckage of my old life instead of just trying to rebuild what I'd lost. When it was time to leave, we stood outside the coffee shop in the drizzling rain, neither quite sure how to end the conversation. "I don't expect everything to go back to the way it was," Zoe said finally. "I know trust has to be earned, and I know that takes time. But I hope someday we can have more conversations like this one." "Me too," I said, and realized I meant it. As I drove home, I thought about the strange turns life could take. A year ago, I'd been a struggling small business owner whose daughter barely acknowledged his existence. Today, I was the partner in a growing company, with financial security I'd never imagined and the respect of people who mattered to me. The fire had taken everything I'd built over 40 years, but it had also cleared the ground for something better to grow. Marcus had been right that first morning. Family wasn't about blood or obligation. Family was about the people who showed up when everything fell apart, who believed in your worth when you couldn't see it yourself, Who helped you build something new from the ashes of what you'd lost? I'd found my real family, and maybe with time and patience and honest conversation, I might even get my daughter back too. That evening, Marcus came by my apartment with takeout from the Vietnamese restaurant down the street. We sat on my small balcony eating spring rolls and watching the sunset over the city where we were building our future. "How did it go with Zoe?" he asked. "Better than I expected. Still complicated, but better." "Good. She deserves the chance to learn from her mistakes, just like everyone else." We ate in comfortable silence for a while, watching traffic move through the streets below. Finally, Marcus spoke again. "You know what I'm most proud of about this whole thing." "What's that?" "We did it right. We built something that matters, something that makes people's lives a little bit better. And we did it by being who we really are, not by pretending to be someone else." I nodded, thinking about the customers who trusted us with their cars and their problems, about the employees who took pride in their work, about the community we were building one honest interaction at a time. "Your father would be proud of you," I said. "Both our fathers would be proud of us," Marcus replied. And sitting there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the lights of a city full of possibilities, I knew he was right.